Week. He'll be back on Monday. David Smoke, Craig Smoke, 365 Sports. And we have heard and discussed some of whatever private equity might mean. The Big 12, of course, that came up last week as a conversation. Even Florida State has looked at the possibility of using private equity as they try to get themselves out of the ACC. So Sam Loughlin, Chief Executive Officer, Paceline Equity Partners in Dallas. He graduated from both Texas and also earned a degree at Baylor. Joins us on 365 Sports. Sam, thank you very much for your time. We do appreciate you. What is the main goal of, and you're a part of it, you're the Chief Executive Officer, what is the main goal of a private equity?
One, thanks for having me on, evening. But bottom line, to make money for your investors. Private equity is kind of an elastic term. It covers a lot of different types of investments, but at the end of the day, they're all designed to return positive cash flow to their investors.
So, Sam, there's been some kind of I think it bogs down the conversation. It's like, hey, private equity, and I've seen folks quickly go, no, this is private investment. Is there a true separation? You just mentioned both terms there, but is what we're talking about in this case private investment, or is it private equity, or is it still the same thing for us, us dummies out there?
Well, again, yeah, private equity is what you would call a suitcase term. Credit fits into it, leverage buyouts fits into it, lots of different types of investment strategies. The details around what the Big 12 is doing are pretty scant, but it looks like it's an equity investment, meaning the investor here, the private equity firm, would be buying a percentage of effectively the future cash flows of the conference.
It's a conference that doesn't have, it's making money. They have a really good TV deal, but nothing compared to the Big Ten and the SEC. And the ACC is about where the Big 12 is, give or take a little bit. If they get it's an infusion of money, but how does the Big 12 make enough money to pay that back?
Well, they've got to grow. The valuation details have been kind of all over the map, from $800 million to $1 billion, from 10% to 20%. But let's just do simple math. Private equity investor puts $1 billion into the conference, which can be distributed to those conference members, the schools, for which they're going to receive 10% of all future cash flows that come off of the league. Right now, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? I think I saw maybe $470 million is what was doled out to the schools. So if it's $1 billion for 10%, that's a 20-year payback, and private equity is not going to be interested in those type of returns. So either they're going to take more of the conference, more of the future cash flows, or they're banking on a tremendous amount of growth to generate the types of returns they need to hit.
Sam, when you first saw this story, and as you said, it's still scant on a lot of the details, but when you first saw this, it's not the first time we've heard private equity involved, and there's been the examples of, the NBA and pro sports and all that. But when you first heard this in the Big 12, what were just your initial thoughts as far as that type of a partnership, and would it make sense or not?
Complicated. That was the first word that came to my mind, because are you going to be aligned as a conference? The private equity owner is going to want as many members as possible, right? They're going to want to see growth. And they don't really care whether it's an equitable distribution amongst the schools. They just want their 10%, in our example, to grow. Whereas the conference may look at a college and say, this college doesn't deserve an equal share, or maybe shouldn't even be a member, or we need to swap them out for a bigger TV market. And you potentially have a lack of alignment. And then you know who your partner is day one, but they're ultimately going to want to sell their investment. I don't think they're going to, hold it in perpetuity depending on what type of vehicle they're investing out of. Typically, they're thinking in 5 to 7 year terms. Who's going to be your buyer? What kind of restrictions or approval rights is the conference going to have? Can CDC sell it to the Chinese government or Trump media, or people that the board of directors don't necessarily want as partners? So it's a complicated deal because it's never been done, at least at the collegiate level, and making sure everybody's aligned to the outcomes. And Big 12 needs to be careful. These guys are going to be smart, and they're in it to make money, and they're only limited by their creativity. So they're gonna try to set this up as best they can for them to generate the highest returns possible. Hopefully that's mutually beneficial, but not necessarily.
So if whatever it ends up being, 800 million or $1 billion, whatever, 16 teams in the Big 12. Are you saying that if in fact somebody was to be a partner with the Big 12 or whatever that term would be, would they then want decision making on if somebody's not carrying their weight and request they be moved out of the conference? Is that something that could be a part of the discussion?
It's definitely going to be part of the discussion. What rights they have as investors, what rights the conference has as far as their investment. So those investor rights will be heavily negotiated. For the minority interest that's being discussed, I wouldn't expect the private equity partner to have much control, except the ability to protect itself against certain actions. If we were talking about private equity coming in and buying 51% of the Big 12, well, then it's no longer really a college conference. It's a privately held company being run for profit. So, at these levels, I think the conference would still be in firm control, and all they're doing is, at $1 billion, they're accelerating 2 years of cash flow so they can distribute that out, but giving up, future 10% or 15 or 20% of future cash flows in perpetuity.
So, Sam, you said something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
You said something earlier that just caught my attention as far as adding. So, do you think that a private equity, in order to ensure more of a chance of return on their investment, would want expansion, for example, of, hey, I know you talked about like having say on teams potentially and things like that, but in theory, would they want like, hey, we need 8 more schools because that's 8 more potential revenue streams that add to the pile to get us our money back? Or would it be more along the lines of like, let's stay status quo? Do you get what I'm saying there?
They're going to want the most revenue growth that they can get.
Yeah, just period.
Whether that's naming it the, all-state conference, licensing deals, they're going to want as much revenue period as they can get. Yeah, full stop. They want growth. And it's the only way it makes sense because at these valuation levels, it's too slow a payback. They're gonna want to see more than $50 million coming in. They're gonna want to start to see $100, $120 million and really drive that revenue. And the Big 12 has the ability to accelerate some cash flow, invest in their programs, and hopefully, put themselves in a position for that growth outside of expansion, but, putting quality product on the field so that TV channels will pay more money for it, right? Those broadcast rights.
How do private equity firms make money, and where do the investors come from? How does that work?
Yeah, when you're talking private equity firms the size of those being discussed around this deal, it's primarily institutional investors, everything from sovereign wealth funds to pensions, to university endowments, to large family offices, but primarily all institutional investors. And, a typical private equity setup, the investors make a commitment to that private equity firm that they will fund investments up to a certain amount for an investment period called 4 years or 5 years. And the private equity firm makes money off of what's called promote, or a general partner interest, basically a profits participation above some set return. Let's call it an 8%, above an 8% internal rate of return, or IRR. The private equity firm enjoys 20% of those profits. And that's, plus they have management fees, but at its core, the best alignment is they should be making money off of outsized returns that they're delivering for their investors.
So, Sam, this is, according to various, folks who've asked around, just very much something. I mean, your Mark's got a background in this, partnerships, things of that nature. So it makes sense where it's coming from. But, not everybody's like, all right, we're doing this and we're moving ahead. It's not officially done by any means. But I think you kind of, said this earlier. But do you think private equity is something that makes sense for college sports, an entity like the Big 12 in their positioning? Or do you think, like there is a lot of doomsday naysayers of like, oh my God, you welcome this in and it's all over college football as we knew it? Do you have any hard stance at all, either way on that topic?
I think college football as we knew it's already over.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
It's a business now, with NIL money and the transfer portal. It's a business.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always been a business, but they at least tried to pretend it was about the student athletes.
Right.
Now it's about the money and it's about being competitive. So, attracting investors, you're going to look for the lowest cost of capital, whether that's a loan, whether that's selling equity. But if you're outside the Big Ten and the SEC, you're having to get creative to try to survive and be relevant.
If you don't mind me asking, do you recommend the Big 12 do this?
I would have to know a lot more about the details of the deal.
Mm-hmm.
I can see why the Big 12 is exploring it. The ability to improve their facilities, put a little more NIL money out there, get better players, better product, put themselves in a better position to stay competitive with these other two super conferences. I can see why they're exploring it, and I see the industrial logic of it. But you just really have to think through all the unintended consequences of it. It's just never been done. And you are a business now. The veneer's gone, and you've got a partner, and that partner wants a return on its capital. And that's just going to require a real full mental shift into running a business versus a university college athletics program.
Would the private equity that infuses that money into, let's say, the Big 12, do they get a say in where that money goes towards NIL or coaches being retained or facilities, things like that?
I think that's all going to be on the negotiating table. I'm sure they want to see that money utilized to grow revenue for the conference, right? So they don't want to see it going into places that are not going to generate a return on investment. At the same time, the universities are going to want as much flexibility as they can have with their money, and they're selling their interests. So I think that's going to be a heavily negotiated point. How this capital is going to be used to grow revenue for the conference.
As somebody that's in private equity, again, Paceline is what you do. You're the chief executive officer. You went to UT, you went to Baylor. You've seen what's happened in college football. Obviously, Texas has this massive budget and what they're doing. They've kind of separated, being a part of the SEC, and Baylor and the Big 12 are trying to play catch-up. What do you think when you hear that maybe from either the uneducated or people who just maybe don't know that private equity is a bad thing? I mean, that's what you do for a living. You're incredibly successful. So is your company. But are there people that just don't know enough about it and so they feel like people are selling their soul?
Look, private equity is made up of thousands of funds, and there's good actors out there, and there's bad actors. There's good investors. There's some that don't last that long. Private equity typically uses leverage, which creates risk, but they're doing it to generate better returns on their capital. When they do it prudently, they generate spectacular returns. When they do it imprudently, it can cause a company to fail. And there's examples of both throughout private equity's history. I think it would be up to the Big 12 to structure this in such a way that it doesn't create risk for the conference, and is simply a cash infusion. But if it gets structured as a preferred equity interest or a loan, they're injecting some risk into how well the conference will perform financially that doesn't exist today. But they're also looking at the world changing around them. They got to do something, right? I love Baylor, graduated in '94, undergrad there. Big 12's on borrowed time if it can't find a way to compete with the SEC and the Big 10, right?
Mm-hmm. No, you're right. Right now, it looks like it's like a rocket fuel. The rockets take it off, and there's only 2 conferences attached to it. We'll figure out what happens with the ACC. So if they contacted you, and I don't know, maybe they have or other.
No, they haven't.
Okay, but if they contacted you, what would be a couple of questions you would ask them if they wanted you to help infuse the money into the Big 12?
Well, starting with the cash flows, and understanding all the sources of revenue, understanding how often that revenue can be changed. So with the TV contracts, what is it, every 5 or 7 years, you're looking at how much growth can we get there, what naming rights, what are all the assets, and what are all the cash flows, and where can we predict that there is growth that's going to generate a solid return on our equity investment. After you get comfortable with the financial profile, it's then going to get into the negotiation of control rights and when can I sell my interest? Do I have a preferred return until I get my capital back? There's just a lot to negotiate, but it's going to begin with understanding the cash flows. How much cash is going to come off this league for how long, and at what rate can we expect it to grow?
Yeah, and would that be something that a private equity would want in a short-term, long-term type, I guess, lens that, okay, what can we get? How quickly can we get something back? But in the end, is it a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year? I wouldn't think they'd want to wait that long to get anything in return.
Yeah. It depends what the vehicle is. It depends what the return profile is for the vehicle. So, for our fund, we're typically underwriting 5 to 7 year hold periods. And so we'd want to be confident that we could monetize that investment during that hold period. This may be what's called an evergreen vehicle, and they look at it as a cash flow perpetual profile. And as long as it's a healthy yield on their equity, they may be able to put it in a vehicle that they could hold it forever or hold it for 20 years. So I think it just depends on the type of investor and what they've told their investors the type of investments they're going to make are. And again, it's all over the map.
Yeah.
You have all types.
Last thing, Sam, and again, first of all, thanks for your time, because I, if anything, wanted to kind of learn more about it. I did. I know that Craig did. I know that our audience did, and I think we have. As you've watched college sports, as somebody, as you mentioned, that loves Texas and Baylor, and you even said, listen, man, the veneer's off. What do you see? Is this sustainable, all of what we see going on?
Kind of moving into the philosophical here. If I want to watch professional sports, I think the NFL puts a better product on the field.
Amen.
If I want to root for student athletes, that's gone. So I'm kind of trying to decide, Baylor basketball will always have me.
Yep.
But I'm probably less enthusiastic about college sports in this environment than I was before it changed.
And that's one of the things that we've talked about as a group, that you wonder about how much of an attrition of the fan base might happen, even if the 25 or 30 alphas continue to grow and get better and have all these championship opportunities or whatever. You wonder about the attrition of college fans that might just get disinterested or like, no, I don't like that anymore. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but at least that's in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, just like proteins, right?
Mm-hmm.
Proteins are bad for a long time. There's fan attrition. College has always been able to keep their fans because there's a tie-in and nostalgia. It was an important part of all of our lives to be there. But when it becomes a business, that becomes less relevant. And it's really all about, is this a high quality product that I enjoy watching? Because it's just a business now.
Sam, thank you very much. Appreciate the knowledge. Sam Loughlin, Chief Executive Officer from Paceline Equity Partners in Dallas. I mentioned he is